All right, so in this video, we're going to continue talking about the interwar period. Outside of Europe. So in this video, we're going to talk about Japan, Africa, kind of generally speaking as a whole, and Latin America. So we're going to be doing a lot of globe trotting today. So first up, Japan. Now, Japan was an ally in World War I. And like Italy, felt like they were disrespected at the Paris Peace Conference. But unlike Italy, the racism against non-Europeans actually affected the Japanese. So when it came to post-war alliances and treaties, they saw Japan, who was just as industrialized and rich as any of the European countries, as less than a European power. So, for example, the Washington Conference, which happened in Washington, D.C. in 1928, set a limit for navies. So how many ships each navy could have, how many ships of each size a navy could have. Japan was given 80% the size of the other allies. So the United States, Great Britain, France, they all get to have a regular sized army, or navy, excuse me. And Japan is given one that's 80% the size of the other ones, just because they're Japanese. Now, as we move forward, the Great Depression hurt Japan particularly hard. Mostly because they are a highly industrialized economy. And like a place like Japan or a place like Italy, instead of becoming more democratic as a result of the Great Depression, the Japanese become more conservative. They become more nationalistic. And kind of think about how this might kind of fit in and this kind of fits into ideas about democracy and progress being suspicious. So the same kinds of cultural ideas that were at play in Europe, we're also seeing here in Japan, that democracy and science and progress may not be what they're cracked up to be. And so, in response to the Great Depression, Japan becomes much more nationalistic. And this brings us to what many historians now consider to be the start of World War II. This is called the Mukden Incident. And this happens in 1932. Basically speaking, Japan probably framed Chinese nationalists for blowing up a railroad bridge in an area of China controlled by Japan. So this area was called Mukden. This starts a Japanese invasion of China. And by the end of 1932, Japan now controls all of Manchuria. And if you remember, Manchuria is this area in northeast China, and it was also home of the Qing. That's where the Qing came from. Now, we will talk more about Japan and China as they move into World War II. So we'll come back to this story, but Japan's reaction to the Great Depression was not one that we would see in the United States or Great Britain, where there was some attempt by the government to fix things. Instead, Japan kind of turns to the military as a way to fix things, and they believe that the right thing to do is to recreate a Japanese empire, and they're going to actually take over China. But we'll talk more about this when we get into World War II itself. Okay, so we don't have a whole lot to offer here about Africa after World War I. More or less, the situation in Africa is the situation we find in many other places that are still colonies. We saw lots of African soldiers fight in Europe for colonial powers. And like the Chinese and like the Indians, they thought that this would help them gain independence. And there were a few African delegations at the Paris Peace Conference, and they were all ignored. So they thought that fighting for European powers in World War I would help them gain independence. It didn't. Basically, after the war, the colonies kind of went back to being colonies. And they just provided raw materials for Europeans. But we are starting to see a little bit of movement. So, like Gandhi, some Africans were brought to Europe for an education. And when they returned, with ideas about nationalism and democracy, just like what happened in India. These ideas are aided by African Americans who promote an idea called PanAfricanism. And basically, what PanAfricanism says is that Africans need to unite if they want to be independent. But unfortunately, for most Africans, they will not gain any sort of independence until after World War II. So we'll pick this story back up after we finish talking about World War II. So the last place we need to pay some attention to is Latin America. Now, Latin America is different from the other places because Latin America wasn't as involved in World War I as any of the other places. So they were involved, but not to the same degree as African or Indian people. So Latin America wasn't as involved. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to be affected by the post-World War I period. So, unlike India or Africa, Latin America was more influenced by Marxist ideas than Enlightenment ideas. So people from Africa who are going to Europe to get educated are learning about democracy and equality and ideas that are associated with European Enlightenment. Latin America is more influenced by Marxist ideas. So they're not as influenced by European political ideas. A lot of this has to do is connected, a lot of this is connected to poor peasants and their exploitation by big agricultural companies. Basically, we're talking about haciendas. So if you remember back to when we talked about Latin America, Latin American independence, the haciendas were a way for rich landowners to control poor peasants. And these poor peasants are going to look at what Marx says about the exploitation of labor. And that's what they are going to latch onto. Now, as we move forward into the 1920s, American interests are going to take large pieces of Latin American economies. This is known as dollar diplomacy. So instead of Americans taking over Latin America, American companies are happy to take over the economies. So they're not using bullets, they're using dollars. And this got really bad after the Great Depression. Because as we said when we were talking about the Great Depression, Latin America was hurt really badly by the Depression. So American companies who had money could pretty much buy whatever they wanted. So this might include mining rights, farmland. So pretty much any kinds of raw materials they might want, they could just buy. Associated with this is the idea that the Americans saw the Western Hemisphere as their protectorate. It was their job to protect the Western Hemisphere. Now, at first, this meant from Europeans. But later, this protection turned against quote unquote instability in Latin America. And so the American military in the 1920s and the 1930s will intervene in countries that are unstable. And when we say unstable, that means moving against what the United States wants. So a good example of this happens in Nicaragua. So in Nicaragua, the leader of Nicaragua, his name was Augusto Sandino, was assassinated by American-trained Nicaraguan soldiers for opposing American interests in Nicaragua. He was replaced by a guy named Anastasio Somoza, who pretty much did what the United States wants. There was an exception to this, and a big exception to this is in Mexico. So in Mexico, the president of Mexico, his name was Lázaro Cárdenas, nationalized the oil industry. Basically, what this means is that all the oil in Mexico belongs to the government. And this really angered American oil companies. Who had bought drilling rights and land to extract the oil. Now, earlier American administrations might have actually invaded Mexico for this. But President Roosevelt instead negotiated a settlement and the oil companies were bought out. So the Mexican government paid them some money for their trouble. So we're going to stop there. In our next set of videos, we'll start talking about why World War II gets started. So we'll go back to Europe and look at what happens in Europe to spark World War II. So that'll be our next video. And until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.